What would happen if you combine the most diluted painting technique with the less diluted one? Well, let me tell you that this unlikely combination will allow you to build up texture fast on your otherwise boring armor panels while still being kinda smooth. So in today's video, I'm gonna show you a step-by-step guide to learn this technique, all the tools that you will need, and how to use it to achieve smooth and fast result. Let's jump in. When I first started dry brushing, there weren't like dry brushes. And then came Artist Opus that I think really changed the way we think about dry brushing. Thanks to them, people started actually introducing a little bit of moisture to their dry brushing, creating smoother results. So no more rambling, let's just get started by going over the tools you'll need. You're gonna need a wet palette or palette of any kind, dry brushes, the round one, whether they're Artist Opus or AK or any other brand, really. Paper towels, no need for texture palette this time, just paper towel will do. And the final sacred thing, the most powerful, oh my god, that's so good thing. Okay, no, it's actually just a sponge. Later on in the process, you'll see why the sponge is key. The sponge is not soaked with water, so it's like damp, not dripping wet. So let's start with step one. Getting the highlight points right on such a big flat surfaces can be really challenging, as I always explain to my students. But don't worry, you will be able to change placing of the highlights without much issues, so don't stress it. Don't stress it. This technique is perfect to paint or sketch big panels of armor without requiring many layers of dotting or stippling, while still being kind of smooth. The key thing that you have to keep in mind in order to understand everything is paint consistency. So please download the consistency cheat sheet down below for free, so you have that to follow along while watching the video. Moving on to step 2, I start with my bigger dry brush from AK. I tap it on the sponge so I have a little bit of moisture, and then I load the paint by again gently tapping in the edge of the color. So not in the middle, but on the edge. This tapping motion that you're using to pick up paint are going to be the same one you will be using on the model. The pressure that you use for your brush stroke is pretty important, so just be delicate as a flower. Step 3. Here we want the paint to cover 80 to 90%, only in the first part of the application. Let me show you directly what I mean. Apply the paint to the model with a soft tapping motion, aiming to almost fully cover the black primer. Test the coverage of the paint directly on the model. If it's too see-through, just tap more in the paint. Here, the extension of this first part of the application depends a lot on the result you want to achieve and how much contrast you want to have, and blah 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 blah. Here I wanted the result to be pretty dark because it's a dark angel, so I'm gonna cover just half. Step 4. With the paint still wet, you're gonna quickly rub some of that paint off by tapping on the sponge and on the paper towel. This will both dilute the paint a little bit while also unloading a bit the brush, wicking off the excess, which in turn will allow you to actually do the glazing part of this technique. Tap the still wet edges of the previous layer, gradually moving towards the shadow area, continuing till you almost covered the whole panel. The movement is the same. You are gonna lightly, gently, delicately tap the surface. The less diluted paint will still be wet, and by tapping slightly on the edge, you'll create a good blend, while the tapping motion will ensure that you'll create an interesting texture. Be careful not to tap too much on the wet areas, because you're gonna rub off the paint, leaving holes. It's just too risky, don't do it. I do it because I like to live in the hedge. Again, to show you how easy and forgiving this technique can be, just look at this example. Here I make a mistake, but I'm able to fix it just by rubbing off the paint with my finger, leaving just the lower part intact. This makes this technique very low pressure. On areas where you have both sides to blend, like in the upper part of the strat node, Go slow and blend one side first and then the other, while also reapplying the paint in the middle between the two stages. Here the consistency that you want is what I call fat glaze consistency. In this step I paint both panels, which in retrospect was a mistake. Don't do like I do what I say, go slow, panel by panel, side by side. If you paint too big of an area, you will have less time to tap your brush and move on to this next step, which will blend the edges. Still, this technique is pretty forgiving, like I said. At this stage, don't worry if the surface doesn't look super uniform. The aim is just getting a basic texture from this, and then we're gonna fix the unevenness, if that's even a word, in the next stages. Also, what you can do, you could do multiple passes with this glaze, applying and glazing, that could smooth out the transition right away. Actually, I just like to move on to the next step, which is step number 5. I'm gonna add additional highlights by mixing my base color with pale yellow from AK Interactive, roughly a 1-to-1 mix. The principle still kind of remains the same. Also suggest to avoid mixing the two tones together using the dry brush. I did, and I feel I kind of ruined the brush a bit. It's not really made for mixing, you know. So already the tapping motion is pretty hard on the brush. Don't want to add stress to that poor guy, right? Especially if you have more expensive brushes like the Artist Opus brushes. But like I said, the steps are the same. Figure out where you want to place the highlight, pick up the paint, tap it on the sponge, like the paint to be like almost fully opaque, tap the excess off on a sponge and paper towel, unloading the brush a bit, and finally apply it to the edges with the same motion. This time though, you will not be extending it too much, otherwise you will kind of erase the middle tone we created in the first steps. As the smaller surface you have to dry brush glaze is harder to do, and it's also the lighter color, and it's just harder. So even if you do, don't worry, because in step 6 we're gonna just go back in with the first base color, dry brush glazing on the areas where you see the inconsistencies or where you expand the highlight layer too much, whatever. Here it's just to rebalance and clean a little bit the surface while still maintaining that nice texture. If you practice enough this technique, you can achieve a pretty amazing result without ever getting your hands on a detailed brush. So I think it's really worth investing the time to learn this, not just because I kind of made it up for you, and also I think it might be actually better than other tools. Like for example with the airbrush, painting vehicles and bigger things might be easier and also faster, and the results looks okay, but to me it always looks a little bit off because of that fake and clearly airbrush look that I don't really like. Whilst with the regular detailed brush can take ages. So this technique can also work painting a larger model for a competition. And it's perfect because you can sketch everything and then you can decide to jump in and do more targeted glazing or chipping and other interesting stuff like that. Step 7, well, it's about the same of the previous one, but with shadows. I'm just gonna reinforce them in the same way that I did the middle tone. Like in the highlight layer, mix the shadows with the detail brush and then apply it. And at this point, you can ditch the dry brush and finally use your detail brush to do some refinement. And I'm not talking about touching the blends, because at this point I think they're gonna look pretty good with the double middle tone glazing. Shadow glazing is gonna look really cool, and you can do like back and forth between these until you're happy. Other than that, you're gonna just use your detail brush to do some edge highlights and some recess shading. I use just plain back paint for this, but you can use oils or panel liners or stuff like that just to give more definition to our panels. When you have these type of surfaces, you kind of need to have edge highlights because they're just there, you know? It looks pretty fucking cool, and I'm really happy how it turned out. So yay me. But what if you have too small of a surface to use this technique? There's actually another solution that I discussed in this video here. So if you want to know how I achieved this result here, just click on the video and there you go. See you there. Oh, actually past me there.